The shepherd's pie had gone cold on the counter, and the candles on my birthday cake had burned down to small, waxy stubs before I finally blew them out myself. 65 years old. I'd been planning this dinner for 3 weeks. I'd driven to the Loblaws on Carling Avenue twice. Once for the lamb, once because I forgot the Worcestershire sauce. I'd made enough food to feed 8 people comfortably. The dining room table had a proper cloth on it, the good one my wife bought in Charlottetown years ago, and I'd pulled out the chairs that usually just sit pushed in. Nobody came. Not my son, not my daughter-in-law, not my 2 grandchildren, who I hadn't seen since Thanksgiving. My daughter called at 6:15 to say she was sorry. She'd completely lost track of the time. And maybe we could do something next weekend. She said it like she was canceling a dentist appointment. I said, sure, no problem, don't worry about it. Then I sat at my own dining room table with a plate of shepherd's pie and ate my birthday dinner alone. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I'm not a man who complains easily. I spent 38 years as a civil engineer for the city of Ottawa. I raised 2 kids mostly on my own after my wife passed from cancer when they were 9 and 12. I coached hockey until my knees told me enough. I am not someone who sits around feeling sorry for himself. But that night, looking at the empty chairs and the uneaten food and the cake I'd bought from the Rideau bakery because it was my wife's favorite place, that night I let myself sit with it. Really sit with it. Not push it away or rationalize it or call it fine. It wasn't fine. And I knew exactly why it had happened. My son, he's 41, works in logistics, good man, always has been. Had been different for about 2 years. Not dramatically different. Just quietly, steadily less present. Fewer calls. Holidays that got complicated or shortened. Explanations that didn't quite add up, the kind of change you notice but hope is temporary. His wife had moved up here from Mississauga when they got together 5 years ago. I didn't dislike her immediately, which I think is worth saying. She was confident, put together, always had a reason for everything. I thought some of that was just personality. It took me longer than it should have to understand it was something else entirely. The birthday was a Saturday in November. By Sunday morning, I'd packed up the leftover food into containers and stacked them in the fridge. By Sunday afternoon, I'd started paying closer attention. Not in an aggressive way, not out of spite, but that empty table had done something to me. It had made something click into focus that I'd been letting stay blurry because it was easier. I started thinking about the last 2 years in a more deliberate way, going back through the moments that had felt off and asking myself what was actually happening in each one. My son had missed my surgery 2 years ago, nothing serious, a hip replacement, but a surgery nonetheless. His wife had been organizing a trip to her parents in Mississauga that same week, and apparently it couldn't be rescheduled. My son had called me from the road, while they were already driving, to tell me he wasn't going to make it. He sounded strange on that call. Flat. Rehearsed almost. At Christmas 2 years back, I'd shown up with gifts for the grandchildren and been told they were spending the holidays at her parents'. I'd known nothing about this until I was standing in the driveway. My son had texted me from inside the house, not called, texted, to explain. A family barbecue last summer, my daughter had organized at her place in Kanata. My son showed up alone after 40 minutes, said his wife wasn't feeling well, left before dinner. My daughter had called me later that night. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. I started writing these things down, just a list in a notebook. Not as evidence of anything yet, just to see them together, because I had a feeling that when I looked at them together, they would tell me something I hadn't been ready to hear. They did. The pattern was simple once I stopped giving it the benefit of the doubt. Every time my son and I had plans, real plans, things on the calendar, things he'd agreed to, something would come up that required him to be somewhere else, and the something was always connected to her. Her family, her schedule, her needs. The gradual removal of me from his life hadn't been accidental. It had been managed. I didn't go to my son with any of this. I want to be very clear about that. I'm a practical man. You don't confront a situation before you understand it, and I didn't understand it yet. I understood the outline of it. That's not the same thing. Instead, I called my daughter. We talked for 2 hours on a Wednesday night in late November. She'd been watching it too. She'd been trying to talk to her brother about it for over a year, and each time the conversation had gone nowhere. He'd defend his wife. He'd say everyone was misreading her. He'd apologize for missing things, but frame it as circumstance, never as a pattern. My daughter is sharp. She's a nurse practitioner at the Queensway Carlton, and she doesn't have much patience for dishonesty, including the kind people do to themselves. She told me she thought her brother knew something was wrong but had convinced himself it was manageable, that he'd made a choice even if it hadn't felt like a choice at the time. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. A few days after that conversation, I ran into my son by coincidence. He was at the Home Depot on Baseline Road picking up something for the house. I was there for weather stripping. We had coffee at the Tim Hortons in the parking lot, and it was the first real conversation we'd had in months. He seemed tired, not physically tired, something else, the kind of tired that comes from carrying something you can't put down. I didn't bring up the birthday. I didn't bring up any of it. I asked about the kids, about work, about his back that had been giving him trouble. He seemed relieved by the ordinariness of it, like he'd been bracing for something, and I hadn't delivered it. When we said goodbye in the parking lot, he held on to the handshake a second longer than usual. I noticed that. December came. I kept my notebook going. What I was beginning to understand, piece by piece, was that my daughter-in-law had built a very specific architecture around my son. It wasn't dramatic. There were no screaming fights, no obvious cruelty, nothing that would look like anything from the outside. It was quieter than that. It was the management of information. What he knew, what he heard about his family, what version of events reached him. It was the management of his time, which had slowly become entirely organized around her priorities. And it was, I was starting to suspect, the management of his sense of self. Because the man who sat across from me at that Tim Hortons was not someone who trusted his own judgment very much anymore. I want to be careful here because I don't want to paint her as a villain without explaining what I mean. She never stopped him from calling me. She never said, "Don't see your father." It was more precise than that. It was 100 small things over 5 years that added up to my son becoming a person who, without quite realizing it, organized his life around her comfort first, her family second, and the rest of the world, including his own father, somewhere further down the list. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. In January, I decided to stop just observing and start doing something constructive. Not confrontation. I still wasn't ready for that, and I didn't think it would work anyway. What I decided to do was make myself useful. I called my son and offered to take the kids on Saturdays when he and his wife needed a break. No agenda, just offered. He sounded surprised and then genuinely pleased. The first Saturday I took the grandchildren to the Science and Technology Museum on St. Laurent. We were there 3 hours, and I spent most of it answering questions I didn't know the answers to, which the kids found hilarious. The next Saturday we went skating at the Lansdowne rink. The one after that we made chili together at my house, because my older grandchild had decided he wanted to learn how to cook. Those Saturday mornings gave me something I hadn't expected. They gave me time with my son. Not a lot. Just the drop-offs and pickups, and the occasional coffee in my kitchen while the kids got their boots on. But it was unscheduled time. Time that hadn't been planned by anyone. Time that didn't require permission. In those small pockets, my son started talking to me again. Not about anything important at first. Hockey scores. A problem at work he was thinking through. A book he'd read. The kind of conversation we'd had easily for years before it had quietly stopped. I didn't push. I had learned something useful about patience in 38 years of managing infrastructure projects. You do not rush a thing that needs to develop on its own timeline. March arrived. The tax season, which I mention only because it's what cracked things open. My son called me on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual. He called late after 9, which was more unusual. He said he just had a question about RRSPs, which I'd helped him set up years ago. We talked through the financial question. Then he paused for a long time and I waited. He said he'd found something. He didn't say what at first. He was circling around it. I stayed quiet. He said that he and his wife had a joint account for household expenses. He'd been meaning to look at the statements more carefully for a while, but kept putting it off. When he finally looked, when he actually sat down with 3 months of statements, he found a pattern of transfers he didn't recognize. Regular amounts, irregular dates, going out to an account he didn't have access to. He asked her about it. She had an explanation. She always had an explanation. But this one didn't hold up when he asked a follow-up question. And then it changed slightly, and then it changed again. He was quiet for a while after telling me this. Then he said, "I think I've been pretty stupid, Dad." I told him he hadn't been stupid. I told him that intelligent people make this kind of mistake all the time, and what mattered now was what came next. I told him I needed him to do something for me. I asked him not to do anything for 48 hours, not to bring it up again, not to make any decisions, not to let on that anything had changed. He said, "Okay." I hung up and called a family law lawyer. I'd been referred to by a colleague in the spring. Her name I won't mention, but she practices out of an office near Elgin Street, and she knows exactly what she's doing. I'd had an initial call with her back in February just to understand my son's situation theoretically, without naming anyone. I now called her with specifics. She confirmed what I'd suspected. Before my son did anything. Before he said anything further. Before he changed any financial access. Before he made any move that could be interpreted as confrontational. He needed documentation. The statements. Records of the transfers. Any joint financial instruments, the more specific and thorough the better. I relayed this to my son the next morning. He was quiet at first. Then he said, "You've been thinking about this for a while, haven't you?" I told him since November. Another pause. Then, "Did you talk to my sister?" I told him his sister was worried about him and had been for some time. He didn't say anything for a moment. I could hear him breathing. Then he said something I won't forget. He said, "I kept thinking if I just kept things stable, if I didn't make waves, it would get easier. I thought I was protecting everyone." I said, I know you did." What followed over the next several weeks was careful and deliberate. My son gathered what he needed quietly. He spoke with a financial advisor at his bank, separately from any account his wife could access. He contacted a lawyer of his own. He did all of this methodically, without drama, while maintaining the surface appearance of normalcy at home, which is harder than it sounds, and which I know cost him something. I helped where I could. Mostly I was just available. He called at odd hours sometimes and I picked up every time. We talked about practical things mostly. There was one call around midnight where we just talked about the senators for 20 minutes, which I think we both needed. His wife noticed something had shifted. By April, she was home earlier in the evenings, more attentive, more present. People who are accustomed to a certain kind of control can sense when it starts to loosen. My son told me she'd suggested they take a trip together, just the two of them, somewhere warm. He'd said he'd think about it. He asked me what I thought. I said, "I think you should do what feels right to you, not what feels strategic. That's the difference between her approach and yours." He was quiet for a second and then he laughed, just briefly. That was enough. The formal conversation between my son and his wife happened on a Thursday evening in late April. I wasn't there. I didn't need to be. He'd prepared for it over weeks. He knew what he wanted to say. And he'd made his decisions clearly and without anger. He told her what he'd found, what he'd confirmed, what he'd done about it. He told her he wanted her to move out by the end of the month. She cried. She apologized. She said she'd explain everything properly if he gave her time. She said he was misunderstanding. He said he didn't think he was. He said it calmly, apparently, which surprised her. I think she'd expected him to still be the man from 2 years ago, the one who could be redirected, reassured, smoothed over. He wasn't that man anymore. She moved into her parents' place in Mississauga at the end of April. My son called me that night. He said, "She's gone." Then he said, "I haven't felt like myself in years. I forgot what it felt like." I didn't say I told you so. I didn't say anything like it. That's not what he needed, and it wasn't true anyway. I hadn't told him anything. He'd found his way to this himself, in his own time, and that mattered. It mattered for his dignity, and it mattered for what came after. What came after has been slow and sometimes hard, and not simple at all. Separation isn't simple. There are children involved. There's a house. There are lawyers on both sides doing their careful work. I'm not going to pretend it's been clean or easy. But the man who calls me now is different from the man who sat in that Tim Hortons parking lot last fall. He calls when he wants to, not on a schedule. He disagrees with me sometimes, which he hadn't done in years. He took the kids camping in Algonquin in June, and he called me from a spotty cell signal to tell me about it because he knew I'd want to hear. My daughter and her brother have dinner together now most Sundays, either at her place in Kanata or at mine. Last month my son came over on a Saturday, just the two of us, no kids. We ordered pizza and watched the Senators game, and he fell asleep on my couch somewhere in the third period, the way he used to when he was in his 20s and would drive up to Ottawa from wherever he'd been living. I sat there after the game ended, in the quiet of my own living room, looking at my kid asleep on my couch. 66 years old next November. I think I'll make shepherd's pie again. This time I won't be eating it alone. I've thought a lot about that shepherd's pie going cold on the counter. It seems like a small thing. It was a small thing. But small things have a way of telling the truth when bigger things have been dressed up too carefully to show it. What happened with my son didn't resolve itself because I forced it. It resolved because I chose not to. That distinction matters more than I knew at the time. When I first sat down with that notebook in November and started writing down the moments that hadn't added up, I had no plan beyond simply seeing them clearly. I wasn't building a case, I was just refusing to keep looking away, and that act of honest attention, quiet, unglamorous, done mostly alone at my kitchen table, turned out to be the most useful thing I did throughout all of it. I think about what my son said on that late-night call in March, that he'd been trying to keep things stable, that he thought staying still was the same as protecting people. I understood that. I'd done versions of it myself, told myself that not pushing was the same as being patient, that letting things go was the same as being mature. There's a difference, though, between patience and avoidance, and I think it took both of us longer than it should have to learn it. What I know now is that the right thing and the easy thing rarely arrive at the same time. Choosing to pay attention when it would have been simpler to dismiss it, choosing to gather information when it would have been easier to have the argument. Those weren't dramatic decisions. They didn't feel like courage in the moment. They just felt like the next reasonable step, and then the next one after that. But looking back, that steadiness was what made the difference. Not anger, not urgency, just the willingness to keep thinking clearly when the situation was designed to make clear thinking difficult. My son found his way back to himself. Not because I rescued him. I want to be plain about that. I gave him information. I stayed available. I didn't make his problem about my feelings, what he did with all of it, the weeks of quiet preparation, the difficult conversation, the decision to rebuild his life on different terms. That was entirely his. The integrity of that belongs to him. I'm just glad I was steady enough not to get in the way of it. There's something I've come to believe, not from any particular philosophy, but just from 65 years of paying attention. The way a person responds to being wronged tells you most of what you need to know about who they actually are. Not the first response. That one's just reflex, the considered one. The one that comes after you've sat with it long enough to separate what you feel from what's actually true. I sat with it. My son sat with it too, eventually. And something good came from that. The Senator's game. The pizza going cold in the box. Him asleep on my couch in the third period. Like nothing had changed, like the last 2 years had been a detour rather than a destination. That's enough for me. That's more than enough.